This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to Connecting the Community, CTC. I'm Lloyd Patterson. With less money to spend, the recently ended Florida legislative session chose not to raise taxes, but to cut spending by more than $3 billion. That made a lot of enemies for Senator Don Gaetz of Niceville and other Republican legislators, not to mention Republican Governor Scott. Well, we invited Senator Gaetz to appear with representatives of three groups that have a beef with legislative actions. We welcome to the panel Rhonda Chavers. In her second four-year term as president of the Santa Rosa Teachers Union, she's served on the negotiations team since 1995. She's worked at Dixon Elementary, Gulf Breeze Middle, and for years at Milton High School, where she's now guidance director. Mary Blackwell of Niceville is president of the League of Women Voters of Okaloosa County. A retired Air Force officer, she heads a consulting business working in high-tech government services. And appearing in her role as a state employee, Dr. Rosemary Hayes Thomas is a psychology professor at the University of West Florida. Her research interests include workforce diversity and pay equity. And we welcome you all to the program. Thank you for being here. Senator Gaetz, first to you. Your read on the session and how it impacted the state.
Hard choices in hard times. When you have $3.8 billion less in revenue coming in, you can make two choices. You can increase taxes or you can try to control spending. And this legislature, President Herodopoulos, Speaker Cannon, wanted to control spending. We haven't had an outcry from people across the state of Florida that what we really needed to do to families who were struggling and small businesses that were trying to hang on was to increase their taxes. So some hard choices in hard times. We hope that better times will allow us to go back to some of the investments that are critical for the future of Florida. Okay,
Senator Gaetz, thank you very much. Now, Rhonda Chavers, Santa Rosa Teachers Union president. You have some issues with Senator Gaetz and the actions taken.
Well, one of the first comments I'd like to comment here now on is that you cut $1.7 billion from the education budget, yet you gave $1.6 billion in tax breaks to the corporations. And so that was kind of a wash. We hurt education, but then we didn't reclaim any of that money by giving those corporations tax breaks. And historically, we've seen that giving tax breaks to corporations has not created jobs. And if you look at Florida's job rate, it hovers around, unemployment rate, it hovers around 11%. And in Santa Rosa County, and I believe in 2007, I was at a luncheon for the Republicans here at New War Landing, and Senator Gaetz had just gotten elected, or around that time, you were new into the Senate. And you said then we're going to try to hold education harmless. I've heard that terminology, holding education harmless. But truly, is it harmless when Santa Rosa County alone has lost over $20 million in their budget since 07-08? $20 million is hard to offset, and we've had to be very creative in the ways not to lay off hundreds of people. And with this past year, we've done a memorandum of understanding with our district to go to have the teachers teach 6 out of 6, and we've decreased the student day to 6 hours. And the state only pays for a 5-hour instructional day, so still yet Santa Rosa County is encumbering that 1 extra hour of instruction.
Okay, I think it's only fair to let Senator Gaetz respond to that right now.
Well, first, thank you, Lloyd, for getting us together and for having this good conversation. Rhonda is right that we were required, because we had less money, to make cuts across the board. There were some places that were cut very deeply and some places that received shallow cuts, but education did receive a cut. Where Rhonda, unfortunately, is wrong is that there wasn't $1.6 billion in corporate tax cuts. In fact, there were only $30 million in tax cuts to businesses. And those $30 million were for Florida's smallest corporations, the mom and pops who pay less than $25,000 a year in business taxes. Those were the businesses that received a tax break, because we believe that it is one ingredient in economic recovery to make sure that businesses that are trying to hold on to employees don't have to give a bigger slice of a shrinking pie to the government. It's also true, as Rhonda indicated, that all of us would like very much to make sure that there's proper education funding. I don't remember ever saying that I would hold education harmless. I wouldn't hold any budget item harmless. I think we're obliged to tweezer through every part of the budget and see where we can make the best decisions and be the best stewards. As a former superintendent of schools and a former school board member, I'm a strong advocate for education, and I hope we can increase education funding as soon as the economy recovers.
Rhonda Shavers, will come back to you in just a moment, but now Mary Blackwell, head of Okaloosa's League of Women Voters, which has interests in many different areas and studies a lot of issues, and I know that you have a couple that you're concerned about, the legislative actions this year.
I sure do, Lloyd. Now, I could go on and on, but I'm just going to focus on our two main issues. And our two priority issues for this session were the election reform with the quotes around it, bill, and also the passage of the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. It's going to be on the ballot. It's a ballot initiative on the next election in 2012. And we strongly opposed both of these. The first one, the election reform, for our purposes, it was a solution in search of a problem. Constantly when you ask the representatives, why are you doing this, it was to prevent fraud. Well, when the Daily News had one of their folks investigating this, since January 1st, 2008, there was 31 cases of fraud investigated by FDLE, and that's about 10 a year, and our population is 18.8 million. So not a huge problem, obviously. But of course, I have no problem with getting rid of voter fraud. That's a bad thing. We don't want voter fraud. But the way we see it, what this does is it discourages people from registering to vote and actually from voting. The early voting hours were actually left the same, but the time was shrunk down to a single week. So what that means is the supervisors can still have 96 hours of availability, but now they have to pay overtime for many of those hours, and there may even be another pay differential on Sunday. I'm not sure. So
you got the election bill. You don't like that. And
the other one, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. This is one that we fought last year, and we fought it again this year. The problem we have with that one, it puts into the Constitution, if approved, it puts into the Constitution a formula based on inflation and population increase, and to limit revenue increase. And in theory, that sounds like a really good idea, but in practice in the state of Colorado, it didn't work out well. There was lots of cuts in infrastructure, and what they found out was in the good years, there was no money to put away for the lean years that are sure to follow, and there was no recourse because you cut the budget in the lean years and then cut it some more in the good years, and it didn't work out well. So we need flexibility in revenue, and I'm not talking about raised taxes, but we need flexibility when the need arises.
Okay, Mary Blackwell, League of Women Voters, you heard her concerns. Why don't you take on the election law change first?
Well, first of all, Mary and the League do a great job in being a watchdog for issues like this. And as far as the elections bill was concerned, and it passed, and I voted for it, I insisted on some changes to the bill before it passed. Now, Mary's right that there are very few cases of election fraud, particularly in our area. But in Broward County, in the last major general election, over 90% of the provisional ballots were found to be wrong. They were found to be inaccurate. They had to be challenged by the election supervisors and the folks working in the polls because the individuals coming forward to vote in a provisional way, their addresses or their identities didn't match the voter records. So it's true that in this area we have great supervisors of elections and we have people who really obey the law. But there are parts of the state where there is really a problem. And so, therefore, folks from South Florida came forward and said, look, we need to tighten up things where we have a problem. And so that's what the election bill did. It said, look, when you come forward to vote, you need to prove that you are the person you say you are so that we can have full and fair elections. The other thing we did in the bill, and I'm sorry Mary objected to it, was to make sure that in this bill, we ensured that military voters overseas had their votes counted. We made sure that they could use the federal write-in ballot if necessary, if their regular overseas ballot did not come in. And I'm sorry that the League of Voters didn't like that bill. let me tell you that she's right when she said that we kept the number of hours of early voting the same. There was a proposal to cut the number of early voting hours in half. I opposed that proposal, and I worked with Republicans and Democrats, including the incoming Democratic leader of the Senate, Senator Chris Smith, to fashion a compromise to keep the same number of hours of early voting. Now, it's 96 hours of early voting over, I think, 9 or 10 days as opposed to 14 days. But we extended the hours to make sure that here in our area, for example, our military voters who work on the base and often can't get back to vote early before the close of regular business would have extended hours to be able to vote. I think that's the right thing to do and not the wrong thing. The other concern or comment she had was about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and she compared Florida's bill with Colorado's bill. Well, the first thing I would say, deeply respectfully, is read the Colorado bill and then read the Florida bill, and you'll see that they're not the same. I would have voted against the Colorado bill. Here's what the Florida bill does. It says that state government should not increase taxing and spending more than the additional population that come into the area. If there are more people, then we need to have more services and more infrastructure, and to take account of inflation. If sweeping, compound, and paper costs more money in the private sector, then government has to pay more for it as well. The important part of what we call smart cap, and it's very much a Florida bill, is that we want to make sure that in the good times, government doesn't do what was done between 2000 and 2006, and that's build substantial recurring increased government expenditures off of speculative real estate prices that drive up taxes. Cities in the state of Florida increased their taxes by 104% in those 6 years. You know, that's just wrong. So what we want to do is ask the people of Florida if they want to put fiscal discipline in the state constitution. In the good years where there's extra money, we don't do what Colorado did, but instead we put the money aside so that when we have tough years like we're having now, there be money to buffer the cuts and not have some of the problems that the other panelists are concerned about.
Okay, Mary Blackwell, we'll have an opportunity to come back to you in a moment, but first of all, let's go to our state employee representative, Dr. Rosemary Hayes-Thomas. Thank you very much for being here with us. And what is the, we know state employees were a bunch of unhappy people.
They were. Some of them are or will no longer be with us, for one thing. I'm referring to cuts in employment in the state. And I know that everyone in the country and everyone in Florida is very concerned about jobs and what can be done to bring more business and more opportunities for employment, for better employment to people in Florida. But it seems, I don't understand how you decrease unemployment by laying off state employees. That doesn't make sense to me. I think from the perspective of state employees, the main objection that they would have to the results of the legislative session has to do with the 3% required contribution to retirement. When you first think about that, it seems like, what's the big deal? Everybody else who has a retirement plan is expected to contribute to it. But the problem here is that in Florida, wages for state employees, in particular in education, I'm an employee of the University of West Florida, and I can say that our salaries are the lowest of all of the universities in the state system. And so in order to entice people to work in a situation like that, there are other benefits provided. And one appealing thing has been the retirement program. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing to realize is that this 3% contribution requirement comes in a context of a situation where raises have not been presented to people for 4 or 5 years. And so, in effect, what you're saying is, okay, you guys have been working along for 5 years without any increase, even though things around you cost more, and now we're going to cut your pay by 3%. That's how it's interpreted by state employees. I did notice in today's newspaper there was an article saying that the sheriff of Santa Rosa County has proposed that he search within his budget to provide a 3% increase to make employees whole. And he's talking about employees whose salary levels are really not what they should be, as I'm sure Senator Gaetz would agree. Okay. So I think the main thing about this issue is that some state employees feel that we have been targeted in particular, even though we had nothing to do with making the problems, the financial problems that the state is dealing with. Another issue that, and I can't say how widely of concern this is among other constituencies of the state employees, but I know that on campuses there will be objections to the decisions about drug testing. The one that affects state employees, as I understand it, is an executive order rather than a piece of legislation that was passed. And I understand that this is probably going to be challenged, so we don't know how it's going to turn out. But in the first place, there certainly are reasons to test people for drug use, illegal drug use, when there is some problem that suggests that this might be the issue. Right. But to simply decide that randomly or on some other basis without any indication of drug use that people would be tested is, to me, a violation of constitutional rights when those employees are public employees. Okay. And it also relies way more than we should on a testing technique that is problematic in its accuracy. It also makes available private information about people's medical conditions, and I just think it's a bad idea.
All right. Dr. Hayes Thomas, for UWF, a state employee, she's laid out her primary objections. You want to respond to those, Senator Gaetz?
Sure. Why don't, thank you, Professor, and why don't we talk about those in reverse order, the one that she talked about last, drug testing. And it is true that the governor, by executive order, says that we need a drug testing program for state employees because he comes from the healthcare community and he knows that in the private sector it is routine that we do drug testing. I own a small company here in Northwest Florida. We use an 11-panel drug test on everybody we hire. We're not required by law to do it, but I think it's the right thing to do because our employees have contact with people, and those folks, those customers, those clients have a right to know if somebody's using drugs and using them in excess or using them illegally. The professor indicates that there may be constitutional problems. If there are, then that'll be news to the millions and millions of private sector employees and employers around this country who use drug testing routinely. But I think that folks have a right to know whether the educators who are teaching their children, the folks who are working with their children in locker rooms and in universities and a lot of very close quarter places are individuals who are drug abusers. I think that's probably not a controversial thing for many Floridians.
Now, the 3% contribution to retirement.
Yes. Well, I think the professor makes a good point that that this comes at a time when, sadly, we're facing some hard times across the economy. But here's the thing to remember. First, in the 1970s, Florida public employees paid into their own retirements something. Again, is it a revolutionary idea that people ought to contribute something toward their own retirements? We do it in the private sector, and we do it in 49 other states. In 49 other states, public employees contribute to their own retirement, including a lot of states that are led by liberal Democratic legislatures and governors that probably are more to the liking of the other panelists, and the world hasn't come to an end in those places. Public employees haven't quit in droves as a result. Instead, it is a way for people to take some limited responsibility for their own retirement. But even with the law that was passed, the taxpayers will still pay a majority of the retirement of public employees in Florida.
All right, if you just tuned in, you're watching Connecting the Community. I'm Lloyd Patterson. We have Senator Don Gaetz, Republican of Niceville, a member of the Senate leadership, sort of on the hot seat here this evening, answering questions from three groups that rose strong objections to legislation passed in the last session. Rhonda Shavers with the school teachers of Santa Rosa County. We'll go back to you. You want to
Yeah, I'd like to comment on the legislation that's notorious these days. It's called Senate Bill 736, the Student Success Act. That legislation we feel is fraught with problems. We've asked, I've been on the committee that's helped develop in Santa Rosa County the new evaluation instrument that we've had to use this as the guidelines to follow, as along with a crosswalk with the Race to the Top grant. We've called DOE and asked for questions. The Department of Education. Okay. We've called the Department of Education. We've been to several seminars and workshops and spent hours and hours on this, and it's an unfunded mandate. But one of the major concerns we have is that by 2014, the teachers will be paid by their students' performance, you know, the performance pay. And we have to develop into the course exams for kindergartners. Kindergartners that come into school, if they take a pretest, don't usually know how to even mark, some of them don't know how to use a pencil, but yet they've got to bubble in something for test security. It's just fraught with all kinds of problems and issues.
Ms. Shavers, we're kind of running out of time, so we've got to let Senator Gaetz, and I want to get back to our other two guests as well. Senator Gaetz, you've heard her concern about that.
Well, I think that her concerns are ones that need to be addressed. Senate Bill 736 is based on the premise that highly effective teachers ought to be recognized and rewarded. Only in education do we have this interesting notion that the only way that a teacher can get paid more money is if they get a year older or if they go into administration. I was a superintendent of schools. I was frustrated that the best teachers in the best school district in Florida were being paid the same as the worst teachers in the worst school district in Florida, and that there was no way to distinguish on the basis of performance. And Rhonda is unfortunately not exactly correct when she says that teachers would be paid solely based on student performance. Actually, what the law says is 50% based on the teacher's effectiveness and 50% based on other factors, including those that are developed locally that have a lot to do with customer relations, have a lot to do with the issues that a teacher is involved with in the classroom every day, because not everybody comes to the classroom with the same set of skills. This legislation does not pit one teacher against another or one student against another. Instead, I want to reward and recognize teachers who take struggling students, who work with them, who make marginal gains, but those are big gains for a student who otherwise might regress. The other thing I'd mention in terms of what Rhonda talked about was she said it was an unfunded mandate. Well, again, unfortunately, that's not true. Instead, there is a Race to the Top grant that was made by the United States Department of Education that pays for the costs of the end-of-course examinations that would be developed to determine how well students do. And kindergartners aren't going to do an end-of-course exam like an FCAT. Instead, as every kindergarten teacher can tell you, at the end of the year, they assess students. Students are assessed to determine how much progress they've made. So, you know, are they ready for first grade? I want to reward effective teachers, and I want to make sure that chronically ineffective teachers, that we find a way to help them or help them out of the classroom. And Lloyd, we have 3 years to design and implement the stages of this legislation. And during that time, I've insisted that classroom teachers and parents and school board members be involved in doing that.
Okay, Mary Blackwell, League of Women Voters, back to you. A quick question or comment about the legislature to Senator Gaetz.
I did want to comment again on the voter reform. One of the other big issues we have with the election reform bill was that it puts a lot of restrictions on registering, third-party registration, to the extent that the League has suspended registering voters until there's some closure on this. As you know, the Justice Department is involved in pre-clearance, et cetera. But one thing I did want to address was the provisional ballots. Don mentioned how the 150,000 provisional ballots in Broward County. Well, the way it's set up now, they've removed the ability of people, if you move from county to county, you can no longer change your address at the poll. So you'll have to vote a provisional ballot and then return to your supervisor and show that and prove that your address has changed, and then your provisional ballot will be good. Well, the provisional ballots, as he mentioned, are a lot of trouble for the supervisors, a lot of extra handling, a lot of extra money, and it'll discourage people from voting, or if they go to vote, perhaps they won't be able to confirm their ballot and they won't get to vote.
Is that going to happen, Senator Gaetz?
Well, I think that's awfulizing the situation. Supervisors of elections have indicated that, well, they may have had some of their own suggestions as to how to proceed. Our supervisor of elections in Okaloosa County, Paul Lux, recently wrote a op-ed in the paper saying that he believes that these reforms can be properly implemented. And one of the changes I insisted on that I would hope Mary would support is to make sure that when we have uniformed military who move around a lot, that we make special exceptions and arrangements and accommodations for them so that we don't require the same kind of hoops and ladders that we do when a supervisor of elections or a poll watcher is looking at a picture ID and looking at the individual and saying, well, gosh, you know, you don't appear to be the same person. But we've made special provisions for our military because they move in and out of the area a lot. I think it was a good thing to do. If there are problems with it, we can certainly tweak it in the next session.
Dr. Hayes-Thomas, your objection, you want to go revisit anything that we can ask Senator Gaetz about? Yes, I would
like to readdress the issue of drug testing. I said earlier that the constitutional issue concerns public employees, not private employees. So if private employers wish to use a technique that's problematic, that's their decision. But based on the case law, there are limits on how drug testing can be used with public employees. I did want to mention a couple of other things. In the interest of time, I'll make this very short. One other thing that I think concerns a lot of state employees is two things that didn't happen. One is a lack of focus on sources of revenue. For example, looking through the tax code for what we call loopholes that are illogical and should be closed. And secondly, a lack of attention to issues of ethics. And let me go back for just a moment to...
We don't have much time, so
yes.
we're going to have to let him...
One of the issues that I'll tell you what people are saying. I don't know the validity of it, but they're saying this, that a problem with the drug testing is that the governor's wife owns the firm that's going to be doing a lot of the drug testing, which sounds like a serious conflict of interest.
We only have a minute left. Quickly, Senator Gaetz.
The governor's wife doesn't own the only drug testing company, and if there is a conflict of interest, I'd be the first to raise a problem with it. We need to focus on tax loopholes, but one person's loophole can be the next person's business incentive. Many of those loopholes, so to speak, were put in by Democratic legislatures, and when we've tried to eliminate some of the loopholes, we've had objections from across the aisle saying that these are important incentives to encourage business. But I'm happy to look at every tax loophole, and certainly if the professor can prove to me that there's a conflict of interest or anything unethical about the drug testing, I'll be happy to look at that as well. And thanks, Lloyd, for a great evening.
Okay, thank you very much, Senator Gaetz, for joining us here. We also thank Dr. Hayes-Thomas from UWF, Mary Blackwell, League of Women Voters of Okaloosa County, and Santa Rosa teacher Rhonda Chambers. Thank you for joining us, and I'm sorry we didn't cover everything. We never get to cover everything like we'd like to, but we appreciate your efforts. And thank you for watching. Good night.